You're listening to audio from the Decidedly podcast. For more information, find us on Instagram at Decidedly Podcast.
So I have a question for you. If you're listening to the podcast, have you ever gone through and made a conscious decision to buy a brand because of their position on a social issue, or decided to not buy brand based on their position on a social issue? And so this is something that companies have to deal with all the time. They have to decide how they're going to take a position on a certain issue, or if they're going to take a position at all. And so that's what we talk about today. I talked with Jim Terry, who is with TDS Public Affairs. He's a strategic communications expert. We got into all kinds of decision making that companies have to deal with. And I think it relates to how we have to decide to deal with issues ourselves. So I learned a lot. I know you will too. I'm Sean Smith. This is Decidedly. Hey Jim, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Great to see you, Sean.
We finally get to meet after several times of trying to get this together. So I'm glad we got to connect.
I tell you, I'm the guy who never gets sick. I blame the Petri dishes that I live with.
Well, good. I'm glad we're together. But I wanted to hear from you what you're doing as you help companies craft their communications.
It's we're storytellers, and we'll help our clients tell their story. Sometimes that's a story of what they didn't do, or a story they're trying to avoid. Sometimes it's the story of what they're doing, and they want to proactively put it out there. But very often people's stories are most interesting to themselves and are not necessarily newsworthy or interesting for another audience. And
I get that a lot. I'll start telling a story. Somebody says, "Hey, that's not interesting."
It turns out the desire to be in the media isn't by itself a qualifier.
For sure.
So what we'll do is we'll work with people to develop initiatives that take their story and kind of are filtered around their story, or become a vehicle to make what they're doing more newsworthy and get them into the news cycle and sort of tell their stories. So it's part of it is, developing, the right messaging and saying the right things or avoiding saying the wrong things. Some of it is crisis communications. The number one rule of which the main thing you need to know about crisis communications is stop talking. And, sometimes it's more, sort of involved, it's more strategic in nature of, if let's go and sort of take this program and execute this program and then promote that into the public discourse.
I think knowing when to shut up is key. So, on those crisis communication, sometimes the best thing you can do is do nothing. You mentioned one of the things that you said kind of early on, you said, sometimes the story is what they didn't do. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's you're being accused of something, or you're being you're being attacked in some way, or you have what's really sort of in vogue now is you have an employee who has their interpretation of what happened, and they go and put it on social media, and then a reporter picks that up, and their interpretation happens to fit with the dominant narratives and that are popular and make for good copy for reporters. They just don't happen to be true. And, navigating those kinds of situations.
Well, is it better to just say, hey, that's a pack of lies, or that, that didn't happen, or what do you, how do you approach it?
It depends. It all depends on the situation. A lot of times it's going to be, I guess it's a question of how far off of their interpretation are they, because, sometimes you have that individual's interpretation of what happened, but yet the underlying facts may still be problematic for you as well. Even if that interpretation is wrong, you can still be in trouble. And so it's really situational. I think that's the art form of knowing when to speak and knowing when to stop talking. That's one of the time-tested reporter tricks is they'll just stop talking and let all of this dead silence, hang out there. And human instinct is to try and fill that silence. And so then you'll start talking and say all kinds of things that you may have regretted, wish you hadn't.
What are some of the things that you're seeing that companies are getting accused of that they're having the most difficult time deciding how to respond to?
Well, I think just broadly, it's very geographic. Depends on where you're at. You're going to have various pieces or various sides of the culture wars. I think it's increasingly difficult for businesses to stay out or above of that because you've kind of graduated, several generations of college students who have been sort of led to believe that it is their business's obligation, or their CEO or their executives or their company's obligations to be on the political field and engaging in these culture wars. So you get a lot of pressure, in from that direction. But the other thing that I think, particularly smaller, companies may not kind of realize is that every single decision you make in your business is in some way a communications decision, because all your employees have Twitter and camera phones in their pockets, and and so every decision you make, every policy you institute, you should be thinking in the back of your mind that this is going to be public. And if you don't feel like you have a solid footing, then you may want to reconsider those policies. And so I think a lot of people find themselves unexpectedly in the middle of a story that they never sought out and just didn't see coming.
I've noticed that the decision to, as you were talking about, take a stance or not take a stance on current political issues, hot topics, things like that, has really changed recently. It seems like in the last 5 years for me. It seems like even 10 years ago, a lot of companies remained silent on issues that normally would have, that now they would be expected to speak on. So, for example, all right. So take the My Pillow guy. Okay, so he's selling pillows, and by all accounts, I guess these are fine pillows. And he decides to take a position on election fraud in 2020 with Trump. He's going to take a hardline position on this, and he's just getting blasted for it. And I'm looking at this, I'm going, dude, you had a good life selling your pillows. What are you doing here? And there's lots of examples like that of companies. Another one, maybe Chick-fil-A, took a position on same-sex marriage, and they're selling chicken sandwiches. What are you doing taking a position so hardline on that? And I think in the past, companies have been sort of relegated to taking positions on issues that directly impacted their business. So if you're Chick-fil-A, you might speak out on the FDA rules or mistreat chickens or something. But
those are two very, very different cases. In the sense that my pillow guy, because very often these companies find themselves pushed into engaging. Disney is a perfect example of that. Disney stayed out, and then the media and everybody started attacking them for staying out, and then they got in, and
I mean, they are where they are. Position on the parental rights and education bill in Florida, and I was like, make your movies. What are you doing?
But my pillow, this was something that was very obviously personal, and he felt very strongly about it personally. Nobody made him do that. And then he had kind of the, and I think his problem wasn't just that he engaged, but once he engaged, and he made all of kind of the big drama about, I've got all of this information and I got all this evidence, and held a big dramatic moment to reveal this evidence, and then didn't deliver. Who knows? He may be a king and not a goat if he'd have delivered the goods. And Chick-fil-A, I think, is a different story, where I don't think they proactively went out and took this sort of public stand, as much as people looked at some of the giving and some of the activities of individuals associated with it, and then extrapolated that and assigned that as a position to Chick-fil-A and launched it. But Chick-fil-A just, there was just some numbers came out. They're still, they have been untouched by kind of all of that. And I think that's an important element of it where
No,
when
it
you
didn't.
have kind of outside actors, you have outside actors who are making assertions and trying to assign things to you that you're not actually doing, that's going to have a very different impact than, say, My Pillow, where you're actually doing the stuff.
No, I think that's for sure. And I think you're right. Is that Chick-fil-A got sort of painted with this issue. God, I don't care. I mean, Chick-fil-A could come out against me personally, and I'd still eat there. I mean, I don't care what the position.
Yeah, good chicken. Good chicken's good chicken, man. I don't know
It's
what you
hard
do
to
with
find.
that.
So I don't care what their positions are. I mean, Chick-fil-A. But I think Disney got some blowback on that. What do you think was the calculus in that decision to step into an issue that does not really have anything to do with filmmaking or entertainment at their parks?
Well, at the beginning, Disney, remained silent on it. And then what you saw was a pretty powerful set of activists who have very close relationships with the media. And if you kind of go back to the very beginning of that, you'll find dozens of headlines where these reporters were, sort of openly attacking and goading Disney for not engaging on this issue. And it kind of
Right.
spiraled and
Right.
spiraled. And then they kind of reacted, and because they were reacting late, they've got to kind of make up for lost ground, and they sort of doubled down and went in over the top. And Disney is probably the most interesting case because from a while smaller businesses pay penalties and they get crossways or whatever, these big behemoths have the capacity to absorb a lot and still be fine. But Disney has definitely felt the consequences of this, and they were the first instance where most of these big businesses were, when put in that position, it was all upside profit for them to capitulate and go with that kind of more leftist, philosophy on these policies. Disney is the first one that's now got a lot of CEOs recognizing that, hang on a minute, even though we're big, there's a price to be paid here, and maybe we want to rethink this, because Disney's not done. Where they law whatever DeSantis and the legislature took away their tax giveaways, their kind of their government giveaways, and all the sweetie pies that they had down there. Yeah, that's going to bomb. But patents, trademarks, that stuff doesn't last forever. And Mickey Mouse and all that stuff is old, been around since the 60s. And the only reason they still control it is because Congress has routinely passed extensions of those intellectual property rights for them. Well, that extension is due next year. So a new Congress that may be Republican and may be more in agreement with Ron DeSantis over Disney than perhaps others, all they need to do is don't renew that. And it's estimated to cost Disney another $1 billion, billion with a big B. And so I think the moral of all of that is something we talk about a lot is, know why you're getting in and count the cost. And you have to make a decision. Do you want your business to be about business, or do you feel so strongly and so fervently about an issue that you're willing to put your brand on the line and you're willing to eat the cost and the consequences and whatever comes with that because you feel like this is your duty and this is the right thing to do. But I think so many people get kind of caught up in their Twitter feeds and kind of the emotions of the moment, and they kind of rush in and then ultimately find themselves in a bad place, or even worse, they get bullied into doing something they don't really want to do, and they find themselves not in control of where they're headed.
So, I think the decision there is interesting, on when to speak out, when to shut up. And, you get pushed into some issues and you feel like you have to, take a position, and maybe you don't, maybe you can just be silent. But I think there's been a trend to say, hey, you need to take a position on this, right? You take, for example, Black Lives Matter. There was a lot of pressure on companies that remaining neutral was not acceptable. Okay.
Right.
And so there are more of that's just an example of one, but I think there probably be more where it's going to be incumbent on somebody to take a position on something. So my question is, how does a company decide not just, which side of an issue to come down on, but whether to take a position at all, there's the desire to express your values, be true to your core, be true to your values, and know people what you stand for. And yet at the same time, if it's going to be damaging to your business, maybe your best bet and your best obligation to your shareholders is to not wade in on something that could blow back on you.
Well, I think the better question is why does my brand need to weigh in? So if this is something that I hold personal belief on, and I'm the CEO of Acme Corporation, why does Acme Corporation need to weigh in on that? And why can't, Jim Terry, CEO, go out and fight for that cause? And I think the answer to that question a lot of times is businesses find themselves hostage to their workforce. To the extent that you have, 40,000 employees and, 39,000 of them are clamoring for you to take a position, that's a problem for you. You don't necessarily have all of the options to just say, I'm going to do this as an individual. But I do think that's a question a lot of people are asking, a lot of CEOs are asking themselves right now. Because look, for most corporations, this is dollars and cents. And it has been the equation up until now that the profit was in sort of capitulating to those demands and taking a position on a certain side of it. And I think with Disney, there's now a sort of a cost has been revealed. And as the country kind of moves and the public is reacting to all of this information they're taking in on the news and the latest scandal, and it's a constantly kind of a moving target. And so I think what you see is a Netflix. A Netflix kind of is the sort of the next step in how they've chosen to deal with this. And they got under the gun with Dave Chappelle and all of that. And they were faced with a really, really, really big business choice. They cut Chappelle loose. That's real money. And they ultimately decided not to. And what they have done is, they've sort of staked out and been very clear that says, hey, look, here's who we are and what we're going to be about. If you're not that's right. Okay, but this may not be the place for you because this is what
I thought that was interesting. So, they were getting some pressure from their employees to take some action against Dave Chappelle based on some comments that they deemed were anti-trans issues. And they stood up to their employees, which is different from what a lot of companies had done previous on some of these other issues where they just capitulated and said, okay, we're going to get rid of this person, we're going to disengage from this.
Well, and whatever it is. It's a little bit like taxes, right? When you talk about the hidden cost of taxes and you don't really know how much taxes, are chewing up of income or of revenue because it's so buried and hidden and you pay 5% here and 2% there. And it's hard to kind of add it up and say, hey, this is the impact. And I think a lot of times with businesses, that's the way it is. Whatever impact there is of taking these positions kind of gets amortized and spread out, and maybe it shows up in Q3, and it's not quite so discernible. With Netflix, they were faced with a big hit immediately, and it was very apparent. Like whatever revenue they're going to lose and whatever they're going to have to pay out to Chappelle, it was a big number and it was very visible and it was right in front of them. So it was a very clear contrast for them, this versus this. Go with what these guys are telling us or eat this cost. And so I think they had the benefit of a lot more clarity of what the costs were going to be of capitulating to their employees' demands. And so
I think the financial clarity was certainly there as opposed to perhaps the financial clarity, an example like Disney, for example.
Right.
Certainly the calculus on decision making was easier for Netflix than it was for Disney.
And it's also more, when you think about what the employees were sort of demanding, it also is a unique beast for Netflix, because if you are a creative company and you make content and movies and art, and and art is beauty in the eye of the beholder and all this stuff, and if you start kind of succumbing to these boxes, you're not only taking whatever financial hit over the Dave Chappelle thing, you're constraining your ability to do what you do, because where does that stop if you're a content creator?
And that's kind of that becomes dangerous.
And that's kind of what they ultimately decided is, look, we're a content creator here. There are some limits on what we're willing to do, but these ain't it. And here's where we're at. And I think what they've done is what we've advised a lot of different companies on, on doing is you have to decide what values you're going to stand on. Because in these moments, what it is you have a group of people who are trying to say, these are the standards that you should be held to, and you've run afoul of them. So therefore you should do whatever. And the question is do you as a company, do you as an individual, as a leader in that company, accept those standards? If you don't accept those standards, then what are your standards? And so you have to know kind of what your standards are, believe those standards are acceptable, believe those standards are right, and then be unyielding on them. And that's what you see. I think you've seen Netflix ultimately come around to is here's our standards. We think those standards are acceptable. We believe those standards are appropriate and right. And we're standing on those standards. And if you're not down with it, then this may not be the place for you, but we wish you the best of luck. And so it's about kind of, are you deciding your standards and your values? Are you allowing someone else to assign them and hold you to their standards? Because then it becomes sort of a never ending, extortionate kind of a relationship.
Sure. And I think you could make the case that there's a shorter line to the business revenue and the business creation and product on the Netflix example, that they can't allow employees to be dictating creative content, as opposed to an example like the MyPillow guy that, election issues have nothing to do with selling pillows and slippers.
Right.
for example.
Yeah, and he ultimately, I don't know what went, behind Walmart's decision to cut him loose. One can guess, but it was never really kind of something Walmart, I think, smartly never really got into and talked about. It was a business decision. We're no longer doing business with that guy.
Well, they may be better off not explaining it, to just shut up and go, yeah, we're just not going to do it anymore without they don't have to come out with a big statement. I think there were some other retailers that made the same decision, but
without a doubt, they were 100%, pitch perfect in not engaging that conversation, because there's no, but that gets back into the question of why are you doing this? Now, if you're a company that has made that decision because you really want to signal to the audiences that you're virtuous and we're taking a stand against this nonsense and blah, 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 then you engage that. Because that's what you're out to get. If this is a business decision and you want to cut your losses and get separated from this guy, but you don't want to dwell and live in this moment, you cut him loose. It's a business decision. That's all we have to say about it. Next question.
Well, I think there's another example when you think about the position that Nike took on Colin Kaepernick a few years ago on kneeling during the national anthem, and they really leaned into the support for him. And my guess is that the calculus was that, hey, this is going to really rub some people the wrong way. Some people are really going to like what we're doing. And my guess is, because Nike's not a stupid company, that they had done the calculation to say the people that this is going to alienate are likely not our primary target market anyway. And that if we're running against the values of these people who are not our target market, the drop in revenue from that is going to be minimal to the gain in revenue that people who are aligned with our values that we're going to see increase in revenue from. I'm guessing that was the calculus they had to do.
Yeah, you would assume that there's all sorts of smart arithmetic that goes into making these decisions, and I think sometimes there probably is. I also think that it's a strength of brand issue. If you're Nike and, the, kids who buy your shoes, how much do they really care one way or the other about this? They still want the latest, hippest, coolest shoes, and mommy's still going to buy them for them. And, I think there are certain, risk calculations that would go into that. But, I also think that it's, there are different issues to sort of engage on. And people will, perhaps for a time, maybe pass on the next pair of shoes, but they'll be back to your Nikes. And that's really the model that has kind of, I think, encouraged a lot more businesses to go this way. But then you have other instances like, what was it back, I don't know, a month or two ago, you have DuckDuckGo, the CEO, come out with a long sort of set of tweets around, how they're censoring COVID misinformation. And I mean, and that dude just got absolutely blown up. Like when your
I didn't see
brand
this
is
story.
that
What
we're,
happened?
yeah, I mean, he got blown up. I mean, he was ratioed on Twitter, and it was just, I mean, he was ended up kind of having to backtrack on it. But he came out with all of this sort of moral, vim and vigor of, by God, the COVID misinformation, and we're down, down ranking results. Basically, he says they're manipulating the results away from information they deemed to be, misinformation around. I think it was Ukraine or COVID. I forget which one it was. Maybe in Ukraine. But he was all filled with moral righteousness, and he rolled that out. And then the reality is, like, dude, like your whole house of cards is built on being like not Google, on being not that guy, on being this uber privacy, freedom oriented search engine. And when you take a position like that is so at odds with your whole brand, you're in a very different category of very different kettle of fish than say like a Nike picking up for
So
Kaepernick.
what was the blowback on that guy?
Well, the fact that the whole brand was supposedly committed to your privacy and accuracy, and we just do the results, and we're not manipulating the results like Google. And all of a sudden, you went out in a series of tweets and told the world that was all BS.
You were manipulating the results.
Yeah, it's like, we're just like everybody else. And
dumbass.
And what you've seen since then is one of, I think, the greatest creative concepts that's out there right now, which is DuckDuckGo. They have an ad promoting DuckDuckGo, which is set to the theme of what was it? The old Police song, "Every step you take, every breath you take, I'll be watching you." And it's got a dude in a Google T-shirt overlooking everybody's shoulder the whole time. And I don't know this for fact, but I have to believe that whatever they're spending on that ad campaign is in some way linked to that series of tweets that just absolutely undermined the whole premise for their brand.
Yeah, that sounds like just a stupid move.
Well, and it gets back to the question of why do you do things? Why? And all these business owners asking yourself of, why am I considering engaging this? Why does it need to be my brand? Why can't it be me? Why am I willing to? Have I done the calculations? I think this makes dollars and cents. Do I not care what those calculations are? I just believe so fervently in it. Why are you engaging? And I think a lot of times people just get caught up in the emotion of the moment and don't go through this process.
Well, that goes back to the point is that my guess is that there was no calculation done in that. He's just out there spouting off, and had he stopped to think just a beat, hey, do I really want to do this and make this statement that flies in the face of the brand name I'm trying to create, that he wouldn't have done it. And so isn't the better decision to just shut up? Why is he on Twitter saying that stuff anyway?
Right. And I personally, my theory is that these search engines and these tech, as many sins as they probably are culpable of in the world of manipulating stuff and bias in politics, I think they are under immense pressure out of DOJ, State Department, out of government officials on these issues on Ukraine, because there's an immense amount of let's just say, I don't want to call it propaganda. Let's just say there was a very uniform message being delivered on Ukraine very early on, and that has to be enforced. Yeah. And so I think there are a lot of things probably behind the scenes, a lot of pressures that we're not privy to, that people like that react to, in which they kind of get pushed into directions. Maybe he got caught up in it. Maybe, who knows? Because at the end of the day, CEOs, all these people, they're just people. And, we all have said and done things we wish we'd had back, or a moment we wish we'd, decision we wish we had back. And that's why I think it's important to have people around you, and, don't pick up your phone and go at it until you've had a conversation with some objective people around you that are, willing to kind of point out and ask the questions of what is the objective of doing this? What do we hope to, what return do we hope to get on this? Because let me tell you what the potential costs are going to be.
So when we look at companies that take a position on issues outside of their normal business activities, and so when you look at companies, that to want to lobby the government for things inside their business arena, that's one thing. They're going outside their business arena on the current issue of the day. That's a different issue. The other thing I think is interesting is what if a company just really steps in it, right? So it's a self-manufactured, self-imposed screw up. Take for example, a few years ago, Wells Fargo had some real issues where they were opening accounts um, inappropriately, and they got caught with their hand in the cookie jar. They got slapped. Uh, Take Harvey Weinstein, clearly doing some bad stuff, and so there's lots of examples. Those are just top of my head ones. That here's a company or here's a person who's done something that they have shouldn't have. How do they form a communication strategy? What do they decide to come out and say after that's happened?
Well, I think in those kinds of situations, the number one objective is to regain or to hold trust, particularly trust with reporters and trust with the public. And so a lot of the issues we've talked about have been in a lot of ways high subjective of is this value right over that value, and I think this and some people will try to offer you a black and white, and that's their job to try to force you into that binary. But it's a debatable and subjective kind of thing. When you're talking about violating laws, when you're talking about fraud and crime, it's a black and white thing. And as an institution, you need to retain or regain the trust in that situation. So the first step is get all the facts, right? Understand everything and be very open about what you know. Here's what we know so far. Here's what we found out. We're engaging in this investigation. We're whatever, and whatever the outcome of that is, we hold the highest standards, and we're going to execute those high standards in this situation as well. But then the follow through becomes to be actually walking that walk, and to be very transparent in those moments. Once you're caught, you're caught. You're not going to, trying to be sly and coy with a bunch of statements. All you're going to do is erode the trust and keep people digging and keep people aligning. Because what you want to try to do is pull everybody into your world, and so that when you do speak, they trust the words coming out of your mouth because you're being transparent, you're being honest, you're being upfront. And there's nothing wrong with look, for big corporations that have lots of employees do stupid stuff, and
Well,
so
yeah,
there is no
sure.
sort of profit in pretending like that didn't happen when you're in court with evidence.
Right.
It's about where do
Right.
you go from here and how do you maintain trust, and you do that by being transparent and being the brand that you've told everybody you are, which is we're going to punish those guys, we're going to put systems in place so that doesn't happen again. This is why you can still trust us.
So yeah, you take another example like Volkswagen was adjusting emissions standard or emission calculations during their testing. Clearly, you just fess up and go, hey, we shouldn't have done it, and we're not going to do it, and we're sorry, and here's our fine, and but I think you give some examples of in a big company, maybe something's happening with employees that you don't have all the facts. You don't know did this really happen or not? Are you're saying come out and just say, hey, we don't know yet, but we're going to find out?
Yeah, I think it's it's situational, depends on the situation, but there's nothing wrong with saying thank you for we're aware of this, and we're getting to the bottom of it, and we'll get back to you when we know more. Because a lot of times what's going on is you're not the only one doing an investigation. The public is, the employees are, people are sending information. This information is coming one way or the other. And so you want to try to be, you want to be at least as informed as everyone else is. And that's because that's the last thing you want to do is go out and make a statement based on, incomplete information and then have that being proven wrong. And even though you weren't trying to mislead, it sure looks like you were. This is kind of the Uvalde thing with Governor Abbott, where he was told one thing, he went and said it from the podium, and 3 days later it was proven blatantly false, and now he had to deal with that. And I thought he dealt with it pretty straightforward, which is I was told this, I was misled, I apologize, I'm mad as hell just like you, and you just you take it on. But in that corporate setting, it's really about kind of buying yourself enough time to get all of the facts and sort of figure out what the next play, because the last thing you want to do is be speaking on the record, to the media and be ill-informed about what's going on in your own company.
Boy, no kidding. In your world in looking at strategic communications, what are the most difficult decisions companies have to face or business owners have to face?
Well, I think it's something we've talked quite a bit about, which is when to speak and when not to speak.
Yeah.
But I also think in a world where everything is a communications decision, navigating a crisis communications moment is perhaps one of the most difficult places that people find themselves, because this is something that sort of sprung up, and this was going on in your company, you didn't know it, and what do we say, when do we talk, how do we deal with this? Because even within the realm of of the PR side, you still have labor laws to contend with, things you can say, things you can't say. There's a whole host of other stuff. And so, what we recommend people do to make those moments easier or more productive is prepare. Who is, what is our plan in a crisis situation? Who gets what information? Who speaks? What are our information centers? Where would we get this information? And to have kind of, a whole crisis communications plan laid out, so that you're not in that moment. You just hung up the phone and got news that this is going on. Going, now what? You have an infrastructure and a plan. You have basic holding statements for this kind of thing in place. You have,
what's
a lot
basic,
of
what's
the
a basic
preparatory
holding statement? What do you mean?
Well, a basic holding statement would be something along the lines of, we're aware, we're aware of this incident. We're working with authorities to understand more about what's going on.
Okay.
But our first priority is, it's a generalized kind of, because what you don't want to be in that situation when the media are calling, is to say the words "no comment." Because no comment sounds like you're trying to hide something. Sounds like you're, part of the bad guys. You want to be an open, but at the same time, so you need to say something, but at the same time, you're still gathering facts. You don't want to say the wrong thing. And so having sort of those holding statements, having, basic value statements about your business units, building all of that kind of stuff out, that becomes the toolkit that you draw on. And that doesn't dictate anything, but it gives you a toolkit to draw on in that moment when things are swirling and where answers are elusive.
What's the biggest screw up you've seen a company do? Maybe you work.
I don't know. I think
you just know the story.
Well, if we've ever worked with them personally, we'll be under an NDA. So,
but that's what I'm saying. I'm not asking you to reveal personal information.
Yeah, I look. I mean, I think we've covered a lot of the biggest examples, and I wish I'd held my Duck Duck Go example, because that would have been the perfect answer to that.
That would have been the one.
I think that would have been the one. I think that there's, and look, I'm not sure Disney's story is done being written yet, too. I think their next steps it's going to be interesting, because Disney's is a very interesting place, because you have this confluence. Because when we talk about, like, Wells Fargo, for instance, they're not just dealing with a customer market equation. These are entities that are highly regulated by government entities. And all of a sudden, you're in the news for fraudulent accounts. I'm going to say your regulators have some questions. And so now you're in a whole other game. While you're trying to deal with your market and your customer base and your brand, you got, men and women with authority to make very real changes in your business. Very real fines, very real rules and regulations, and you're into a really multidimensional chess game. And I think it's where Disney has found themselves a little bit too, because they have all these the extension of their intellectual property rights, the deal down in Florida with their tax breaks, or whatever all the goodies they had down there, and you find themselves in this sort of multidimensional game that's about more than just customers and brand PR. And, in that kind of a moment, I think the first tendency of people is to think they have a messaging problem. And, and I think that in the case like, Disney, where there is ongoing activity, at some point it becomes bigger than a messaging problem. It becomes a substance problem, and you have to start making some decisions. Are we going to continue down this path and and continue taking the cost of that, or are we going to start making some adjustments more along the lines of what Netflix did?
Yeah. Jim, how can people get connected with you?
TDS Public Affairs, Tango Delta Sierra, TDSpublicaffairs.com is the best way. We've got information about kind of who we are and what we do there. There's some contact forms and phone number on there. We're readily accessible through that platform.
Perfect. Jim, I appreciate you talking with me, and thanks for sharing your wisdom and helping people with some tough decisions they might have to make. So,
thanks, Sean.
It's one of those things. Hopefully, they don't have to make as tough decisions as we talked about today.
It is. It's a crazy world out there now, but if you kind of know who you are, know what your values are, know what your standards are, hold strong to those, and be prepared for whatever. And assume it's coming. It's not quite as scary as it seems, but if you're ill prepared and you're letting other people dictate what your values are, then it can get ugly.
For sure. My takeaway from the discussion with Jim Terry is really around, in deciding to speak out around certain issues, is understand your why. Why would you want to speak out on this? Is there a business purpose, or is there a values-based purpose for speaking out, and counting the cost of what we think is going to be the calculus of the cost of speaking out on a certain issue. But he also said something I thought was interesting, and that is that every decision you make, every policy you institute is a form of communication. With employees having Twitter and access to social media, everything is communication now. It didn't used to be that way. So those are my takeaways from the great discussion with Jim.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision and leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support. It helps others find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more daily decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com and on Facebook and Instagram at decidedlypodcast. Thanks again for listening. I'm Sanger Smith, and this is Decidedly.
Insights, advice, and comments provided by Sean Smith, Sanger Smith, and speakers identified as part of the Decidedly podcast should not be considered recommendations. Speakers not identified as members of Decidedly are expressing their opinion, and their statements should not be construed as reflecting the views of the Decidedly team. This podcast is produced solely for informational purposes, not personalized advice.